The arrival of meteorological spring has brought with it some glorious clear blue skies filled with sunshine. During the day, although temperatures are cool, under the rays of the sun it feels pleasantly warm. But of course, these clear nights also bring with them a continuous period of cold and frosty weather. Night after night, I find myself meticulously covering my young plants and seedlings with frost protection, desperately willing them to survive. But do I need to be covering them all? Which annuals actually need protection and which ones will manage just fine on their own? You will find so much contradictory information regarding cool flowers or hardy annuals, when they can be planted and just how tolerant they are of winter cold. These contradictions do not mean that one grower is wrong and the other grower is right. They just mean that they've had different growing experiences on their own plots. An exposed site in the same growing zone as a more sheltered spot, or dry versus wet growing conditions, or even the difference between growers that let their plants rough it and growers that offer extra protection, can totally alter the success of overwintered crops. Not only that, but each winter can vary considerably in its severity, meaning one year that all of your crops may survive easily with very little intervention, and another year may be a lot of hard work for very little reward. Here in the UK, the Royal Horticultural Society has created a table and a grading system for hardiness of plants, which is a really useful tool, especially if you're just starting out. I know when I started, I just assumed that all hardy annuals were equally tolerant of the cold. So I treated them all as if they were completely hardy for cold weather and frost. And the result, of course, was a lot of dead, frosted plants that simply would not recover. Of course, we all have different unique growing conditions. So we cannot guarantee that just because this RHS scale says that something can survive down to the minimum temperature of, let's say, -20, cannot guarantee that it actually will, because if you've got really wet conditions or a really exposed site, obviously it's not going to do as well as a sheltered, walled garden. I know myself, I have lost Ammi majus in the past to frost, where if you look at the scale, it should really be frost hardy. Losing these Ammi plants was an invaluable lesson for me, and it definitely made me pay attention to which plants on my plot needed extra protection and which ones could manage just fine without it. Unfortunately for me, the annual area in my cut flower patch is very wet and not great for overwintering crops. But of course, this end of the garden and having the cover on the polytunnel has enabled me to autumn sow some plants and to get them planted in the ground without them getting soaking wet feet outside in the garden. My plan for next year is to get more things sown in the autumn and to make far better use of my 2 low tunnels. And of course, I can use my previous experience to help me decide which plants I'm going to autumn sow and try and grow on outside next year. But I will definitely make use of this RHS hardiness scale as well. If you're not familiar with the RHS hardiness ratings, they provide the absolute minimum temperatures that those plants will tolerate. And if you go on to the RHS website and you search for a particular plant, it will give you lots of information about growing that plant, but you also will see listed there hardiness rating, and it will be a number from 1 to 7, although there are some subcategories as well. There are 9 categories in all, with the least tolerant of cold being H1A, and in fact the absolute minimum temperature that that category can cope with is 15 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine I definitely don't grow any of those here, and a lot of these are really tropical plants. And then it goes through all of the categories until it gets to the hardiest category, which is H7, And these plants are able to survive temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius and below. So I thought we'd take a look at some of the varieties that I actually grow and see what their RHS rating actually is and find out which of the annuals and cool flowers actually are the hardiest ones. I've got to say, I found some of the ratings for some of the plants quite surprising. There were some that I'd considered to be a lot hardier than perhaps they are. I'm going to go ahead and just skip zones H1A, H1B and H1C, which in the US would be the equivalent to zones 11 to 13. And the reason I'm going to skip these is just because the minimum temperature they can cope with is 5 degrees Celsius. And here in my zone 8B, we would never have a winter where temperatures would be above 5 degrees Celsius for the whole winter. It would never happen. So there's not a lot of point in me doing very much research on these zones. So beginning with H2, and this is the equivalent to a US growing zone of 10B. So we're going to go ahead and start with the least hardy category, which is H2, and work our way up to the much hardier category of H7. And we'll look at lots of the different plants that I grow in these categories. Tolerant of low temperatures 1 to 5 Celsius, but will not survive being frozen, except in frost-free inner city areas or coastal extremities. These plants require glasshouse conditions in the winter, but can be grown outdoors once the risk of frost is over, or if crop protection is provided. Love lies bleeding, straw flowers, African marigolds, zinnias, and this was a real shocker for me, snapdragons, and then argyratum or the floss flower. H3 are half hardy, and the minimum temperature range that they can go to is between -5 and 1 degree Celsius. H3 are half hardy from -5 to 1 degree Celsius, but they can be hardy in coastal or mild areas except in hard winters, and are at risk from sudden early frosts. May be hardy elsewhere with wall shelter or a good microclimate, and can survive with artificial winter protection. And this includes varieties. And this surprised me because I would never think of trying to overwinter cosmos. That's always one that I start much later. Nigella I do overwinter. My Rebecca, my Sahara and my Cherry Brandy I know struggle quite a lot over the winter, and I do usually start new plants. Sweet peas I do tend to try and keep protected and then plant them out a little bit later. And then of course I haven't grown the Omphaloides linfolia, but that one is also in this category. I would have never considered that Nigella was comparable to Cosmos, and certainly wouldn't have thought that they would be in the same group. H4 can tolerate temperatures of as low as -10 to -5 and are hardy throughout the UK, with perhaps the exception of inland valleys. At altitude and central northerly locations, may suffer foliage damage and stem dieback in harsh winters in cold gardens. Plants in pots are more vulnerable. The H4 category includes stock, Phacelia, dill, statice, bells of Ireland and Levatra. And again, I had no idea that Limonium statice was quite this hardy. H5 is hardy throughout nearly all of the UK and can manage to be out even in severe winters, coping with temperatures -15 to -10. H5 is hardy throughout most of the UK, even in severe winters, coping with temperatures -15 to -10 Celsius, but may not withstand open or exposed sites or central northerly locations. Many evergreens suffer foliage damage, and plants in pots will be at increased risk. A selection of plants in H5 include calendula, corncockle, buplorum and scabiosa. And now we're getting to the hardiest plants that I grow. And I had no idea they were all quite this hardy. So these are ones that definitely will be good candidates for autumn sowing. So they're in category H6, and according to the RHS, although like I said with the AMI I'm not so sure, they can actually tolerate temperatures down to -20. I suspect my exposed site and wet conditions are probably why that doesn't work for me, but it may work for you. This group is hardy throughout the UK and Northern Europe. Many plants in containers could still potentially be damaged unless protection is given. And as I mentioned, this group includes Ami majus. It also includes larkspur, cornflower, and surprisingly to me, Gadesha. I had no idea that was quite so hardy. And again, phlox, the annual phlox, I always considered that to be a half hardy annual and had no idea it could tolerate such cool temperatures. The final category, which is H7, can actually go even colder than that. And I always knew that Dorcas grew well for me if we had frosts, and now I know why, because according to the RHS, Dorcas is one of those plants that can actually tolerate temperatures of below -20. I mean, my Dorcas must think it's tropical here, because we're never going to get temperatures that low in my cutting patch. I'm sure there are lots of other plants in this growing category, but from the plants I was researching, which were obviously cut flowers I grow in the cutting patch, Dorcas was actually the only one I found with a H7 rating. I think the important thing to remember is if you autumn started plants that you hadn't planted out yet, or even plants that you may have started really early at the beginning of this year, you absolutely must acclimatise them by hardening them off for a few hours over the course of a week or a couple of weeks before you plant them out. Because even if you're growing plants that are hardy down to those lowest temperature, they will still suffer from transplant shock if they have a sudden change in temperatures and growing conditions. And if you think there's any chance that you're growing plants that will be shocked or will not cope with your growing conditions, you can of course offer them extra winter protection. I am desperate to be sowing some more seeds, but there still seems to be a little furry friend in my greenhouse. So for the time being, I'm having to hold fire, which is very frustrating because we are spring is here, we're in March, and not only do I want to finish getting my hardy annuals sown, but I really want to start thinking about sowing some of the half hardy annuals as well. Although having just been through these hardiness ratings, I'm really not sure that calling them half hardy or hardy on the seed packets is actually very much help at all. Do let me know in the comments which of the plants you've been growing have surprised you with their hardiness, whether or not they're much hardier than you had been led to believe, or perhaps plants that you thought were hardy have actually turned out to be a little bit more fragile. What have you got overwintering outside, and are you protecting it with any form of fleece, or are you just letting it do its own thing and get on with it? And if you're going to let me know that in the comments, do also let me know a little bit about your growing plot, if it's exposed, if it's sheltered, because I do think this is a really interesting topic. And as I said, there is a lot of really contradictory information out there, so it can be really difficult, especially for new growers, to get to grips with what is hardy and what isn't. Thank you very much for coming along with me again today. If you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up. And of course, if you'd like to follow my gardening, growing and very soon flower arranging and bouquet making journey, then you can subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to contribute towards the making of these videos, you can buy me a coffee, and the link for coffee buying is in the description to the video. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.